5, 4, 3, 2.
Hi, welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us today. We'll take a few more moments before we begin as more people are still joining the webinar.
Good evening. It does look like everyone who is waiting to enter the event has logged in. We are good to go.
All right, welcome everyone to our fourth speaker event in the Talking Politics series, organized by the University of Chicago's Center for the Study of Communication and Society, as well as University of Colorado Boulder's Program in Culture, Language, and Social Practice. My name is Lily Ye. I'm a doctoral student at Chicago, and I'll be the moderator for the event today. I want to thank all of you so much for joining us for this very exciting series where anthropologists and linguistic experts analyze the 2020 US presidential election. Today, we're very happy to have two presenters, Professor Janet McIntosh from Brandeis University and Professor Norma Mendoza-Denton from UCLA. Their presentation is titled Alt Signaling, White Violence, Military Fantasies, and Racial Stock in Trump's America. After the presentation, we'll have Professor Crystal Smalls from University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, providing some discussant comments, and then we'll open the floor for Q&A. If you want to ask a question, you can look for the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom window. If you click on the button, a new window will pop up and you can post your question there. We encourage questions at any time during the webinar, and we will try our best to answer as many of them as we can after the presentation. However, we understand that politics is a delicate subject, and to encourage a constructive and fruitful experience for everyone, including our presenters, we will be closely moderating the discussion, as well as removing any inappropriate or unconstructive content from the Q&A section. So without further ado, let me pass it over to Janet McIntosh and Norma Mendoza-Denton.
Thank you so much, Lily. I'm Janet McIntosh, and Norma will be appearing in the second half of our talk. We want to thank Wee Young So and Velda Koo and you, Lily, and all the other organizers, and Crystal Smalls for being our discussant. This has been a really well-organized, wonderful series so far. I'm going to share my screen to give you some images. And on this first slide, you can see on the right side, there's a book cover. Norma and I have been thinking about language in the Trump era for a while now. And we co-edited this volume that you can see on the title slide with some really incredible scholars. We may mention some of them along the way today. So after I speak for a while, I will be turning over the floor to Norma. But we do have a heads up about this content. The talk deals with some quite unsettling material, including very disturbing racist rhetoric and violence and the prospect of violence. So the whole talk in a way is about the accumulation of murderous intent, and we do want audience members to be aware that this is coming up. So it's obvious that white supremacy and white violence have a long history in the United States, but for some decades before Trump was elected, presidents were expected to make noises about equality and unity. This was part of the liberal American mythos, and white supremacist militias were largely off the radar of mainstream media coverage, which led many to dismiss them as fringe. But Trump's arrival marked a deadly new era of signaling in which he and his team have one way or another repeatedly conveyed the message that Black and brown people are not quite human, that they and their white sympathizers are potentially expendable, are weak, even killable, and that white militias outside the ordinary channels of state authority should feel emboldened. And a lot of their communication has taken the form of what Norma and I are calling alt signaling, where white supremacists give and receive communications about the expendability of Black and brown people just below the discernible surface. So the dynamics that we're going to describe today intensified in the run-up to the election. Trump is being sort of defenestrated, but he will keep trying to crawl up the side of the building, and he wants to keep the spotlight. His acolytes will continue to organize. They're finding new media channels to do that. So I think we can assume that some version of this will live on. So as I say, we are calling this communicative dynamic alt signaling, and we're going to look at three communicative strategies involved in alt signaling. A lot of these flow from Trump and his administration to his supporters, but it's also been flowing among his supporters. So the first strategy is the militarization of Trump and his supporters' identity. And this has happened in several ways, but I'll be focusing on several semiotic and verbal aspects of this. And to be clear, in militarizing their identity, Trump and supporters have also constructed an expendable enemy within the nation, which sometimes looks like Democrats kind of vaguely writ large. Sometimes it looks like more immediately like people of color and their allies. The second strategy of alt signaling we're going to look at is the indirect signaling of sinister content. This is sometimes content to do with white supremacy and a race war, content to do with a supposed sinister deep state on the left, and sinister clandestine mobilization on the right. And the forms of indirection have included innuendo, dog whistling, encoded messages of a sort that I'll look at a little later, and also inverted discourse. Norma will give an example of that. This indirection has allowed some of the murderous messages to kind of exist, to percolate just below the surface of publicly accessible communication, sometimes anyway. There's been so much of this coded message, in fact, that some of Trump's supporters think he's using even more obscure code than is actually plausible. The third strategy of alt signaling we'll look at is eugenicist ideology, discourse about superior and inferior racial stock. So I'll be focusing most on 1 and 2. Norma will focus most on number 3 and a little bit on number 2. So in terms of strategy number 1, militarizing Trump and supporters' identity, this is important to alt signaling. It's not just about toxic military masculinity, but it also is about foreclosing a channel of meaningful communication with a supposed enemy within the nation and dehumanizing them. Now, the American right has objected for a long time to variations on the theme of new masculinity, and it's long been involved in hypermasculine posturing against the left. Just to give one example, if we go back just a few years to 2013, we can look at the so-called pajama boy meme phenomenon. So pajama boy appeared for the first time in 2013 as part of an ad designed to get millennials to register for the the Affordable Care Act. And the copy on the original ad read, "Wear pajamas, drink hot chocolate, talk about getting health insurance." And it pictured this young man in his red and black pajamas. And the right was apoplectic. Not only did they attack what they called Obamacare, but they also called pajama boy, quote, "a metrosexual in a plaid onesie, an insufferable man-child," and various other sexist and homophobic epithets, sometimes anti-Semitic epithets. And we saw many memes contrasting militaristic manhood on the American right with millennial boyhood, which was being mapped onto Democrats. So the left-hand meme, for instance, is contrasts a rugged World War II GI and all his ruggedness. A few years later, with Trump's rise, we saw the meme on the upper right with the cowboy hat wearing, Tabasco sauce drinking, red sauce denizen. And then after Trump's win in 2016, General Mattis, who was Trump's first pick for Secretary of Defense, was paired with Pajama Boy and a quotation from Sebastian Gorka, who was deputy assistant to Trump for a while. And Gorka was saying that the era of the Pajama Boy is over on January 20th and alpha males are back. So here, Team Trump is framed as the alpha males ready to dominate Obama era Pajama Boy and all the soft liberals that he represents. Note that this is the militarization of the right, not to defend the overall nation, but to own the liberals. Now, Trump supporters have also adopted some militaristic verbal strategies to shut down their perceived enemies within the nation. And in Norma's and my book, I have a chapter about a type of communicative stance taking that has been available for decades in the United States military. It's a stance taken toward the softies who imperil the nation. For decades, drill instructors and drill sergeants have had no patience for the complaints and the sufferings of incoming recruits. And so they frame the recruits as being so soft, they're going to imperil the nation unless they're hardened. And a major technique of hardening them has been verbal. It's been leveling insults like snowflakes, crybabies, buttercups, wusses, weaklings, and a whole bunch of gender-troubled insults. And in my chapter, I developed the idea that this verbal or semiotic cudgeling is designed to callous or harden the new recruit to physical slights and actually also to verbal slights. What Trump supporters did was to take this semiotic callousing and then to direct it at Democrats who became the crybabies, the snowflakes, and the buttercups. So when protesters demonstrated at the women's marches, for instance, or expressed fear and disdain that Trump had the reins of power, not disdain, despair, I should say, that Trump had the reins of power in those early months of the administration, they were shut down as mere snowflakes. And the phrases like liberal crybaby, liberal snowflake spiked on Google searches. So in these memes, Trump and his administration, in the middle actually see General Mattis again, became framed as the enforcers of hardened masculinity and those who showed a lack of empathy toward at least half of the country. And that lack of empathy was legitimized through its alignment with military masculinity. So notice that the stance adopted in this semiotic callousing, the attitude toward the interlocutor, is one that completely shuts down a channel of communication and fails to listen to the complaints or the suffering or the position of those on the other side. Republicans talking to Democrats like this marked a relatively new era of communication. The conceit of a cooperative channel between parties began to dissolve. Now, here's an example that pulls this discourse, this stance taking right up to the present. There was a video posted on YouTube 2 months ago. It was made, this is a short video made by a couple of military guys overseas, and they're peering at the camera and they're doing a kind of skit where they pretend they can see liberals and Democrats through the camera, and they call them, quote, crybabies and snowflakes burning our fucking country down. This is unquestionably a reference to the Black Lives Matter protest movement. So instantly it removes credibility from the movement. And then they go on to level homophobic and infantilizing slurs at liberals and Democrats and protesters. They're drinking unicorn semen, they're living in their mother's basement, and supposedly not even standing up for something. So in this last line, the whole movement about defending Black lives is silenced and discredited. In my next example, we see how wartime footing has been projected onto Trump with the idea that Trump is engaged in a battle with liberals and Democrats. So you'll remember the September debates where Trump made so many interruptions, and even some Democrats objected. They said, oh, this is not civil, it's lowering the tone. But a Republican fundraiser from Texas emailed his contacts. I received some of these emails because I'm on some listservs. It's a long story, but I took an extract from his email where he wrote, Trump is fighting a war for you, me, our families, and the nation. We better not forget that we are in a war and begin to whine because our top general is being too mean and aggressive and forceful when he fights for us. We cannot disengage, whimper, or flinch because we do not like what war looks like. So once again, here Trump is militarized. That means the adversary, in this case, Biden, liberals, Democrats, cannot be listened to, are dehumanized like an enemy. Even when Trump got COVID, His recovery was seized on as an opportunity to make him look still stronger and more pugilistic. And in fact, with this example, we work our way towards the implications of a eugenics ideology. I'll show you what I mean by that. So the two tweets that I've got screenshots of here are actually both posted by Republican senators from Georgia and from Tennessee. So these are people in government participating in this myth of Trump as this strong man who can defeat anything. He's beating up COVID on the left. On the right, this is like a video of the military chopper that took him victoriously from Walter Reed back to the White House. And Marsha Blackburn says Trump has once again defeated China, because after all, Trump was calling it the China virus. He always wanted a military victory, his own personal Vietnam, and here's Blackburn handing it to him. And then he famously landed at the White House and gave a speech from the White House steps saying 3 times, "Don't let COVID dominate your life." In the days that followed, Trump's supporters on the right wing, social media and mass media feminized and infantilized Joe Biden and Democrats and anyone, in fact, who was wearing a mask. Tomi Lahren, the notorious right wing commentator, said, "Might as well carry a purse with that mask, Joe." And then underneath her tweet is Kurt Schlichter. He's a retired Army colonel and a right wing activist, feeding the same myth, this idea that the liberal elite are whiny, high pitched, desperate to have us living in fear. Ask yourself why. There's a little note of the sinister. The binary oppositions that got set up here with Trump's collusion placed Biden and the liberals and masking itself and fearing COVID into the following columns, where Biden and the liberals were masking, fearful, rule-following, wimpy, whining, feminine, empathic, desperate, avoiding COVID, dying of COVID. And Trump was all the opposite of that, pugilistic, tough, masculine, calloused, inspiring, and surviving COVID. So whereas instead of having semiotic callousing of the left, here it's COVID callousing, using the disease as if the disease is simply there to harden and strengthen the nation, and those folks on the right who are not wearing their masks don't fear it and they're going to survive it. Now, Trump never acknowledged the extraordinary racism of this stance, because it's been very well documented that Black and brown communities have been the most vulnerable to catching and dying of COVID. And so this formulation of COVID callousing contains an implicitly eugenicist theory of who deserves to live and prosper. And that's a thread Norma will take up at some length. So the military semiotics of Trump's camp went on and on and on, including the way Trump's fundraisers kept referring to, in their ads, to Trump's army of supporters and enjoining people to enlist, in other words, to like register to vote. His allies on social media would repeatedly refer to themselves as an army of digital soldiers. But again, this is an army not for the nation, but for Trump's hostile white supremacist cause. So the second strategy, if the first strategy is setting Trump up with the stance of a ruthless military leader, totally unwilling to converse with his detractors, and then framing Democrats, liberals, Black and brown people and their sympathizers as the dehumanized enemy, Trump and his white supremacist followers can't afford to be completely explicit about this all the time. So some of this is needed to live a somewhat clandestine or subterranean existence. So the second strand is about indirect communication and sinister subject matter. Now, white supremacists have been using coded information online for a while now to avoid the detection of AI algorithms. So when referring to the phrase Heil Hitler, some have used the number 88 because H is the 8th letter of the alphabet. But Trump has also set up his supporters to look for hidden meaning coded especially for them in his communications. And he began to do this with pretty simplistic communicative messages, and then the dynamic snowballed and was taken up by supporters beyond whatever he did into a kind of fantasy about him having a channel of encrypted alt signaling. So in our book, we discuss several of the chapters actually talk about Trump's racist dog whistling. This first bullet point is something that Norma will take up. During the September debate, he said to Proud Boys, "I don't know who they are, but they need to stand back and stand by." Well, this was taken by them as a signal to them in a military register that he was counting on them to be at the ready to attack, as it were. And then in the town hall, October 2020, he claimed not to know anything about QAnon, even though he has retweeted QAnon followers many times, and said, "I do know they're very much against pedophilia. I agree with that." And so he affirmed their main conspiratorial anxieties, and they took that as a win. And this an innuendo is often accompanied by denials. So Trump has also stoked the idea that there are subterranean forces at work, evil forces that must be combated. There's the alt-right fantasy of a deep state, like a hidden government within the government. This kind of allusion to hidden stuff goes way back in his administration. If you think back to that the seemingly harmless typo of Covfefe, what wasn't so harmless was when Sean Spicer said during a press conference to a press pool, "I think the president and a small group of people know exactly what he meant." So there's an attempt to imply that no, there was some deep underlying meaning, and Trump is always, knows what he's signaling. More recently, in August, Trump told Laura Ingraham that Biden wasn't really in control, but, quote, "people in the dark shadows are. Those people were thugs in dark uniforms on a plane." He gave no further elaboration. This was grist for the mill of conspiracy theorists. And then he would allude in press conferences to Obamagate in terms of terrible things that happened, terrible crimes. All you have to do to learn about it is read the newspaper, except yours, he would say to anyone who is in what he called the mainstream media or the liberal media. So the implication is the real information is out there about the criminal Dems and the deep state, but you have to go to other channels of communication. So the cumulative effect of this was to stoke attunement to alleged deep truths beneath the surface and also encoded truths that can't be spoken directly. Now, given that white supremacists have complained that the liberal media won't allow them to communicate freely about their racist views, it makes sense they would be looking for hidden truths, communicating just under the radar about their schemes. And some of these strands came together in the last couple of years with the QAnon phenomenon. QAnon is a right-wing conspiratorial mass movement. It first took shape around 2017. An anonymous user, or perhaps several users who were referred to as Q, who supposedly had high-level clearance in the Trump administration, began posting conspiracy theories that the Democratic Party is run by a cabal of Satanist pedophiles, and Trump will unmask the cabal, that he and military officials and perhaps his paramilitary white supremacists will bring forth an imminent event known as the Storm or the Great Awakening, and white supremacists will effectively take over. So there's been a lot of alt signaling about the Great Awakening, and it's involved fantasies of encrypted messages from Trump and his team. So my last few slides give you some examples of this. So this slide has a simpler example of supposed encryption. This is an October tweet from a QAnon supporter. He's cross-referencing one of Trump's tweets on the left with a tweet from retired General Michael Flynn, who's been a QAnon aficionado. And this guy's looking for clues that the storm is coming. So first, Flynn tweeted, "Be not afraid." That's that kind of biblical language used to stoke courage. And then, Trump tweeted the next day, "Don't be afraid." Okay, so he said, "Don't be afraid of COVID," but there's a meaningful connection. Actually, this is what Susan Lepselter has called apophenia, where you find meaningful connections between otherwise random things. This next follower, the content of what he thinks he's found is irrelevant. It's in a long email thread. What I want to point out is that he's looked at a timestamp. He's gone to a supposed Q drop on 8kun, which is a right-wing message board, and thinks he's found a connection. And notice that he's saying there's plausible deniability to the world, but ultimate confirmation to us. This isn't a game. Trump himself is speaking to us, and even the tiniest cues, the timing between tweets, the missing letters contain hidden messages. And then a final example, also from October. The president tweets, "I want better healthcare." The timestamp is 5:56 p.m. A corresponding Q drop on 8kun says, the cure will spread WW, which is presumably an allusion to World War. So here, QAnon is getting exciting followers about the possibility of violent clashes. Military operatives do communicate in code so they can remain undetected. There seems to be a little bit of semiotic cosplay here on the part of some of these followers to accompany the sartorial cosplay of white militia members. They're buying up camo and military gear and guns. I've seen some of the tweeters right after the election, they would just tweet a single period. They called it a muster point as a way of signaling readiness. And then they would get 200 muster points in response, as if everyone was saying, we're ready, we're ready. My final slide has a couple of examples of alt signaling by Trump supporters, these little flashes from the underground. So on the left, you see someone flashing their QAnon shirt. On the right, I've circled what's easier to see in a video. It's a supporter at a rally flashing a white supremacist OK sign. If any of you saw Michael Lempert's talk, I think he spoke in the Q&A about how the alt-right has alleged that Trump himself has performed the white supremacist OK sign. They've apparently taken what might just be an ordinary precision grip hand, and then they've treated it as a sort of secret evil twin of the normal OK sign, as if Trump were dog whistling to them with his hands. So even his hands are codes to be cracked. They have their special channels of understanding. So clearly there's been a kind of a thrill and excitement to this idea that momentum is being galvanized. The secrecy itself is a great way to construct the impression of power, important truths barely concealed, and the sense that the right has been beleaguered and oppressed by the mainstream. It's a reification of that notion. And of course, a major part of what is being alt signaled is this chilling, murderous, racist content, this slow moving creep of what looks like genocidal intent. And so that is where I'm going to stop and turn the floor over to Norma to share her screen.
Thank you, Janet. Can everybody hear me? I need some feedback. Oh,
yes.
Okay, somebody raised their hand. Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully do this in a more elegant way than I'm used to. Let's see. Okay, and I'm assuming you can see my screen. Can I get a verbal confirmation? Yes, thank you. And I'm gonna play it. And then.
And that looks perfect, Norma. You're all set.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to pick it up here from where Janet left us, and just also thank the organizers prolifically, and Joe Bonnie for helping us with all of this tech, and all of you who have made the time to listen to our presentation. When we started pulling this presentation together, I realized that there was one particular talk where, a rally really, where Trump talked about the racehorse theory. And when I started to look a little bit more deeply into it, I realized that it pulls together several strands of thought and action that have characterized the Trump administration. I'm going to try to show you how many of these strands of thinking originate in deeply held American beliefs, including eugenics. Even after studying Trump's speech for such a long time, it only became clear to me how many disparate statements and actions are tied together by thinking about eugenics. So I'm going to start here with some questions that will maybe seem a little bit sort of scattered at the beginning, but hope that by the end of this presentation, you'll see how everything comes together through this lens. So leaving aside the creepiness factor, which is, I know, hard to do, we ask ourselves, why does Trump evaluate his daughters' bodies, even from birth? Why would he inspect the merchandise, the women in the dressing rooms at Miss America pageants? Why did Trump say that he wished that Ivanka dated a top football player instead of Jared? Why does he insist on his own bloodline having high IQ and on being proud of his German blood? And when he mentioned this in a summit with Angela Merkel, you could just see her flinch as soon as he said that. Why won't he release his own transcripts, but constantly accuses Biden of being not smart? Why is the ultimate compliment from Trump being told that you have good genes? Why does he not care that Black and brown people are disproportionately dying from COVID? Why would he even consider going with the herd immunity strategy? And when he did get sick, as Janet showed, why was he not chastened with regard to the virus, but instead considered having dominated it as another victory? Why did he sign an executive order restricting diversity training? Why are migrant families with children separated, children caged, and women in detention camps sterilized? Why does he oppose birthright citizenship, but instead wants to have citizenship based on quote unquote merits that include speaking English, as arbitrary as that sounds, and not being poor? So what is eugenics? Eugenics was essentially the brainchild of Francis Galton, who was the cousin of Charles Darwin, and in 1904 wrote, "Eugenics is the science which deals with all influences that improve the inborn qualities of a race, also with those that develop them to the utmost advantage, the improvement of the inborn qualities or stock of some one human population." He suggested that a considerable list of qualities could be compiled, and from the best specimens of those qualities, you would have people who were healthy, had energetic, had ability, manliness, courteous disposition, and at the same time that the community would be trusted to refuse representatives of criminals and others whom it rated undesirable. So you can see this is in 1904, the first reference to this, but by 1913, the United States had eugenic sterilization all over the place, and you can you might also know that the Nazi regime based its recommendations, its eugenics recommendations, on laws that were on the statutes in California and Indiana. So this is a uniquely American history for us. The image on the left-hand side comes from the Human Betterment League of North Carolina. It was a pamphlet that was sent out where it says the average feeble-minded parent, and feeble-minded in this context means low IQ, feeble-minded parent cannot be expected to provide good heredity, normal home, intelligent care, to say nothing of the many other things needed to bring children up successfully. And so you can see right away that there was an emphasis on reproduction and the reproducibility of the body and of desirable traits along with that. So this began this set in motion rather, the forced sterilizations in the United States that have targeted Latinx, African-American, and Native women, and also some men, as well as people with disabilities. And this is ongoing. So at least 100,000 people in 32 US states during the 20th century have been sterilized. American eugenics, as I mentioned, was used as a blueprint for Nazi policies. So we have this medical paternalism that is trying to contain the threat of brown bodies. So the threat of brown bodies, whether they're coming across the border as kids under 5 to be separated from their parents, or alternatively, when Puerto Rico became a territory and people from Puerto Rico could flow freely into the US, there was a huge social panic that they might sort of overrun the United States. And the man that you see in the lower right-hand corner, his name is Dr. Cornelius Rhodes, and he was one of the masterminds of the sterilization program, and even made it onto the cover of Time magazine. And this is partly notable because this is all documented, by the way, in Nelson 2018 in his book, The War Against All Puerto Ricans. So this man, Dr. Cornelius Rhodes, wrote a letter that got out, and it read as follows: Puerto Ricans, they are beyond doubt the dirtiest, laziest, most degenerate and thievish race of men ever inhabiting this sphere. It makes you sick to inhabit the same island with them. They are even lower than Italians. What the island needs is not public health work, but a tidal wave or something to totally exterminate the population. It might then be livable. I have done my best to further the process of extermination by killing off 8 and transplanting cancer into several more. The latter has not resulted in any fatalities so far. The matter of consideration for the patient's welfare plays no role here. In fact, all physicians take delight in the abuse and torture of the unfortunate subjects. And this is a guy who later on got on the cover of Time magazine. In 1965, a survey of Puerto Rican residents found that about 1/3 of all Puerto Rican mothers ages 20 to 49 were sterilized. And Briggs 2001 estimates that 200,000 Puerto Rican women have been sterilized. Puerto Rico, in fact, has the largest rate of sterilization in the world. And of course, the higher the rate of sterilization that could be shown in the hospitals, the more funds flowed into the island. So we see that this type of containment also had its own profit margins and profit schemes. So now we are not surprised that we also have these terms that came in with the Trump administration. We're sort of going back and forth historically here, where Donald Trump uses the terms anchor babies and chain migration together in many of his speeches. And I'll tell you that the corpus linguist in me wants to show you all of the data and every single example. Obviously, there's not enough room for that or time. But I want us to understand Trump not only as author, but as animator of these deep-rooted concepts. Both of these terms, anchor babies and chain migration, defend from the legacy of John Tanton's Latin onslaught papers in the 80s, and at least anchor baby, when it first came out in the 80s and 90s, was considered hate speech. Now it's so commonplace that people don't bat an eye about it, but both of these terms exhibit the quality of alt signaling, as Janet was explaining to us earlier. So I want to show you that this term comes from way back. So this first one says you have, it's from 2015, and he's talking about you have migration because Syria is such a disaster. And now I hear we want to take in 200,000 Syrians, right? And they could be, listen, they could be ISIS. I don't know. Did you ever see a migration like that? They're all men. They're all strong looking guys. Did you see it? They're walking and there are so many men. There aren't that many women. So this, of course, should maybe also jog your memory about the things that Representative Steve King of Iowa had said a little bit after this time about how migrants weigh, what did he say? They weigh like 100 pounds, but have calves the size of watermelons from carrying drugs, right? So there's this sort of fear of the brown body, of possibly healthy and fertile bodies that might take over. Now, this is the racehorse theory that I was telling you about. Donald Trump gave this speech just a couple of months ago, just a few weeks ago, really, at Bemidji, Minnesota, where he talked to the crowd, and the crowd was all mostly Euro-Americans. So he says, they were tough and they were strong. You have good genes. You know that, right? You have good genes. A lot of it is about the genes, isn't it? Don't you believe it? The racehorse theory. Do you think we're so different? You have good genes in Minnesota. They didn't have a lot of money. They didn't have a lot of luxury, but they had grit, they had faith, and they had each other. And of course, here he's not talking about Minnesotans like Ilhan Omar, and he's not talking about Minnesotans like George Floyd. He's talking about the white people in his audience. And often, you know, when Trump is on television, he's aware that the cameras are looking at him, but they're looking at the back of people's heads, of the crowd's heads. So he'll usually pick out somebody with long blonde hair and tell them to turn around, you with the blonde hair, turn around. And again, so he later on, he gives a speech in Des Moines, Iowa, where he says, thank you. Do you see the way they all stayed together? This is a particular family, the Pat Grassley family. They like each other. Speaker of the Iowa House. Oh, you've got to tell me this. This is good genes, I think, right? There are genes involved here, right? Pat Grassley, right? Good genes. What's the relationship? Pat, huh? That's good stuff. You got good stock. We might sort of say, okay, this is one of his innumerable quirks, except of course, they get turned into policy. So the highest compliment that you can get from Trump is that you have great genes or you're out of central casting. But of course, you must first be white to merit such a compliment. His obsession with both family bloodlines and IQ results in his constant name checking of his uncle, his one uncle who was a professor at MIT, and at the same time, Trump challenges others to IQ tests. He boasts about his vocabulary. He brags about his kids' schools, even though they're all legacy Penn, right? So, and so on. So all of this is coupled with attacks on so-called low IQ individuals, usually Black or brown people, or convicted criminals, or prominent Democrats. And what I'm going to show you here, you know, again, I can't show you all the instances, but Maxine Waters, an African-American congresswoman, alone was signaled as low IQ in public rallies 13 times in the space of a year. 13 times in the space of a year, he got up in front of crowds of hundreds of thousands of people and attacked Congresswoman Waters. And as well as, you know, he also says that Joe Biden has low IQ. So as Adam Schwartz suggests, whiteness in some ways is compromised for Democrats by virtue of their solidarity with brown bodies. So brown bodies attract stigma, even to those just standing next to them. Okay, so this is the example that we're talking about of inversion, where there's an attack on diversity training. And the thing that one really would want to notice here is that this Donald Trump issued, again, just a few weeks ago, this executive order on combating race and sex stereotyping. Sounds good, right? So it starts, right? President Abraham Lincoln understood that, you know, the belief that all people are equal is the electric cord that links the hearts of patriotic people, and so on. Then he goes on to say, this belief inspired the heroic Black soldiers of the 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment to defend the Union. It's what inspired Dr. Martin Luther King. And right, so look in the middle of this document. It says, today, however, many people are pushing a different vision of America that is grounded in hierarchies based on collective social and political identities, rather than in the inherent and equal dignity of every person as an individual. The ideology is rooted in the pernicious and false belief that America is an irredeemably racist and sexist country, and so on. So, although presented as new and revolutionary, they resurrect the discredited notions of the 19th century's apologists for slavery, who, like President Lincoln rival Stephen Douglas, maintained that our government was made on the white basis by white men for the benefit of white men. So you can see that the language that we would use in trying to understand and abolish slavery is in fact being overturned to get us to stop talking about racism. And this is something that's also noted in Guerrero 2020, who wrote an amazing book called Hate Monger about Stephen Miller. But the author of this particular, a lot of these writings is Stephen Miller, who through Larry Elder, David Horowitz, and Stephen Bannon, exploit people's fear and demonize others for political gain. So I invite you to go look for yourself at this presidential executive order right now on the whitehouse.gov. Another thing is this dehumanizing of the non-white other. So we talked a little bit about how Trump talks about Syrian immigrants in Europe, but by classifying feared extraterritorial others, especially Latinx, African and Arab men, both migrants and refugees, as diseased animals or monsters bent on destroying culture, Trump makes the case that they are not allowed protection as humans. And this is something that Otto Santa Ana and his students wrote about in our edited collection. So they're not allowed protection as humans, let alone with the same rights as citizens. So Trump was enamored of this idea of shooting migrants in the legs as they cross the border, or if filling I mean, obviously the border wall never got built, but he wanted to make a moat additionally with alligators and so on. I mean, yeah. So, so as far back as August 14, our government now imports illegal immigrants and deadly diseases. Our leaders are inept. And you have to sort of rewind your mind of all the scandals that we've suffered in the past 4 years to turn back to the time where the main thing that he was saying on television here was all of the birther conspiracies. So, right. So in the next one, he said, I said that immigration policies in Europe are a disaster. You're destroying Europe. You're destroying the culture of Europe. The crime is up in those states, in those areas, and you better do something. I tell them that. So, you know, again, all of these are about how people are animals. In the fourth one, they cut two beautiful young girls, 16 years old. They were going home from school and they cut them to pieces. They're animals, and so on. Just trying to catch my breath here. Okay, then we have some of this latest things that have come to light. This is Nurse Dawn Wooden, who I mean, not in the picture. These are people who have been incarcerated in the ICE detention centers at Irwin County, Georgia. Ayuda, por favor, means help us, please. No tenemos protección, tenemos mucho miedo. We don't have any protection and we're very afraid. Help us, immigrants. All right, so Nurse Dawn Wooden became a whistleblower alleging substandard COVID-19 healthcare and abuse at ICE facilities in Irwin County, as well as forced sterilizations. She is quoted in the complaint, quote, "We've questioned among ourselves, like, goodness, he's taking everybody's stuff out. That's his specialty. He's the uterus collector." And the detention facility, which is operated by the private prison contractor LaSalle Corrections, continued to send patients to this man, even after all of this scheme came out. And patients were not provided translation services, and in many cases were given very vague explanations for what would happen to them. And when they complained, deportation proceedings were summarily begun. So much so that at some point there had to be congressional action to prevent them from being deported before they could say anything. So of course, this, I mean, for it to remind you of all of the things that happened in Puerto Rico and how, in a sense, they are still going on over brown bodies. Last week, there's another nurse, Lawana Rivers, who is a travel nurse, who spoke out in a very moving hour-long Facebook Live video against practices at University Medical Center El Paso Hospital. She detailed the existence of a COVID pit, which was staffed exclusively by nurses because the doctors did not want to be exposed. She claimed that not a single doctor set foot in the pit during her month there, and not a single COVID patient, coding patient made it out alive. She also pointed out the financial inequities, as we know exist, so that anyone who was well paid in the system, like the doctors, was both limited in exposure and had enhanced survival rates. She also wondered why Texas was not being talked about when it was so much worse in New York during the spring outbreak, because she covered both. She says, I don't understand why no attention is being brought to Texas. I feel like they're not getting the attention because they're all Hispanic, they're all minority, and it's like their lives don't matter. And here I just want to say that both Nurse Wooden and Nurse Rivers are African-American nurses and are familiar with the history of incarceration, of the devaluing of Black and brown bodies, and of sterilization in the United States. And so they took this risk upon themselves to speak out on behalf of these patients that they felt are not being given even a perfunctory chance to live. So I want to say a couple of things about, here, this is, a lot of data. My next step with this is going to be looking at some theoretical angles to try to work in here. I'm interested in the work of Jamie Thomas for her work on zombies and racial anxiety. And by zombies here, I'm also going to include the undead voters that continue to pop up in conversations in the news these days, as well as Crystal Smalls, our discussant, in her work on white audiences' body snatching of Black bodies through contextualization. So these two scholars offer theoretical avenues for understanding the relationship of whiteness and the dispossession of the brown body. I'm also inspired by Brackett Williams's work on classificatory schemes and the assignation of the death penalty that will also help us to think through the consequences of classifying people as illegal, as animals, as anchor babies, and so on. Williams invites the reader in her work to take a journey through the death penalty classification process to explore what it reveals for how we as a species are increasingly required to have greater respect for taxonomic logics than for human discretionary thought. And here I just want to, in these excerpts, I just want to point out that in this interview with Maria Bartiroma for Fox Business, just in October last month, he's talking first about Joe Biden. And he's saying he's not mentally capable. He's not mentally capable of being president. You know that. Everybody knows that. Everybody that knows him, he can't be president. And this monster that was on the stage with Mike Pence, who destroyed her last night, by the way, but this monster, she says, no, there won't be fracking. That monster is our vice president-elect, Kamala Harris. I want to say that, well, I want to believe, but I don't believe that that once Trump steps down, this could be over. But no, Trump was actually just the perfect storm. Many of the specifics of his immigration policies and the language that they use, like the infamous American Carnage speech, were in fact hatched and written out by Stephen Miller, his advisor, his campaign manager. Stephen, of course, was in turn influenced by Larry Elder and David Horowitz and espoused white nationalist ideology, including the book Camp of Saints, and went on to advise Steve Bannon and Jeff Sessions, who was the person who actually set the migrant separation policies into motion. Migrant family separation policies. Trump himself was just the perfect mouthpiece, mediagenic, type A, and power obsessed for many of the grievances of white nationalists, even though he's not even a properly steady one. So Ann Coulter, who used to be his defender, now has become thorn in his side and his total detractor. Just a couple of days ago, when speaking at UT Austin, she suggested that in fact, it is Trumpism without Trump that we need, now that we've gotten rid of the 8-year-old. And she says, okay, well, he'll still be good for some things. He can be the rally guy, but we need somebody else. We need somebody who's macho and somebody who is, willing to say these things out there. I mean, and you just sort of hear it getting all set up again. So in conclusion, Janet and I talked a lot about how to understand these phenomena. Some of them are historical. I've talked a lot about the historical dimensions. Some of them have been examined by Janet as alt signaling, as prolonged dog whistles. The issue with alt signaling and dog whistling is that they capture a momentary interaction. And of course, it gets contextualized and reified through time. But this stuff with the undercurrents of eugenics are like a deep underground rumbling. It's when you feel the ground shaking and you know there's a tsunami coming up. So Janet talked about militarization and the ways in which this militarization and masculinity are part of the alt signaling that is meant to motivate people who have been on the fringes but are now coming into play. We also have the inversions of civil rights discourses that allude to a discourse that people are familiar with and turn it around completely for a different end. And I want to say that the undercurrents of eugenics for me are the most disturbing, where we have the last surviving member of the jurors of the Nuremberg trials recently said that the family separation policy is a crime against humanity. And I want to suggest that these human rights violations, these crimes against humanity, represent a slow-moving genocide, as Kelly Lytle Hernandez has talked about in her, she's a historian, in her book called City of Inmates. And where do we go from here? These, the International Criminal Court is a potential place where we could have some of these crimes prosecuted once it becomes time to do that. Trump can pardon people at the federal level, but not at the state level. So possibly there's an avenue there. But the International Criminal Court is, of course, housed within the UN, of which the US is part of the Security Council. So it's very doubtful that the US is going to condemn itself in the Security Council. So I'm not really sure about the prospect of that in the International Criminal Court, but definitely please continue to make noise about this particular issue. And I'm very grateful for your participation, and I'd like to turn it over to, well, I guess we'll turn it over first to our discussant, Crystal Smalls. And I know I need to stop sharing, I'm trying. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Janet and Norma, for that insightful, if rather chilling presentation, and for pointing us to avenues for making sense of today's discursive landscape. And like Norma said, we're going to turn to our discussant for today, Crystal Smalls. Crystal, the floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. Thank you. So thank you both so much. This was amazing work, and I really appreciate how you kind of took us on this tour of very unsettling, terrifying, discursive terrain, but terrain that's really important to map and excavate as carefully as you both have. And I also really want to emphasize how incredibly brave this kind of work is, because I'm terrified to hear it and to speak on it. So speaking truth to power, as we hear, that's hard work and that's scary work. Speaking truth to white power and capital W, capital P is no joke at all. And that's because white violence, as your talk made clear, it's not an abstraction, theoretical concept. We see how it's something that's operationalized discursively to, among other things, cultivate, as you said, a murderous intent, and to mobilize, to callous and harden, to call to action. So white violence is something that many of us experience and live against every day. Its numerous forms and sources, its enduring vitality through the past few centuries at least, have helped generate a constant state of terror for many of us, even as we somehow miraculously find ways to resist and refuse and to reform and transform, to love and create, or even just to breathe and survive. And so I'm thinking of these discourses, these alt-right signaling discourses and eugenics discourses, as ones that really mediate racial terrorism or racial terror. And I want to invite everyone to think through this idea of terror as one modality of whiteness writ large. So to do that, I want to bring in one particular theory, necropolitics, which has been expanded by many, but was introduced by Achille Mbembe to talk about the ways the state and often dominant groups not only have the right to kill and let live, but also have this ability to wield the threat of death, and hence, operate through terror, and to expose others to death, physical and social, and then also to prevent and circumvent life. So when we think through this, then these military stances, this kind of self-enlisting into a militarizing body that's at war, mind you, we can think of it as, yes, a call to vote and protest, and possibly, as you all pointed to, an assertion to an authority, a sense of authority to kill, harm, or at least consider it as an evocation of the threat of death. So what I hear in a lot of these discourses is, I could kill you. I have the arms, the training, the moral justification, and permission in many regards to kill you and any of those who I've decided are a peril to the nation or to its real citizenry. And so to think through some of the ways a state of terror of racialized others is maintained through discourse and action, I wanted to connect some of the dots between the racial necropolitics of the state to not only vulgar and explicit white supremacy, but also to white normativity or everyday whiteness, as many have called it. So for me, what connects these three things is this, a structure of white authority or whiteness as authority that then relies on terror and is often executed through different forms of policing. And we can use a pretty straightforward definition of authority from the Oxford Dictionary, which defines it as the power or right to give orders, make decisions, and enforce obedience. And then consider the ways in which that power has been state-sanctioned and culturally sanctioned, formally and informally for many white people, white identified people in the US. And yeah, we can think of it as power, or at least a mediator of power, so that this naming white power by those who cherish this kind of authority is actually quite accurate. And so white authority manifests most plainly through policing or as policing in all its forms, but particularly institutional policing or formal law enforcement, also social policing, which is very tightly tethered to institutional policing, but it's really the ways that quote unquote civilians deputize themselves to police others, other bodies, movements, and behavior. And then also biological policing, as we heard about, these biopolitical policies, practices, and discourses that attempt to physiologically regulate bodies and sort bodies. And so in terms of institutional policing, in the wake of the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor by police, more of us became privy to its complex origins, particularly in slave patrols and bounty hunting, among other things. So slave patrols have been described as forms of organized terror in which everyday white citizens were enlisted into militia, sometimes swore oaths to protect property by policing any ostensibly Black bodies. And their allegiance to policing Black bodies was pretty correctly conflated with serving one's country or maintaining the social order and social good. And of course, slave patrollers couldn't kill Black people with impunity because we could have been someone's property. And so, and then beyond institutional policing, we also trace this history of private citizens authorized with the right to kill to bounty hunters during the colonial period and beyond, especially those who hunted Native Americans. So some of those were organized into mounted corps volunteer scouts who very specifically in 1863, just up the road from me in Minnesota, were paid $25 per scalp of Dakota persons. But many bounty killers, and this is really important, weren't formally enlisted in these militia, and they were often paid more, sometimes 3 times as much as those enlisted. So there's this great reward for voluntarily performing these kinds of policing and punitive duties as part of your everyday existence as a white person, as part of your civic duty. So from this history, we can start to see how both the blurred lines between institutional policing and social policing by real citizens, by patriots, and then also the blurred lines between the military, the police, and the white populace come to be, and thus how they maybe help generate the kind of paramilitary and parapolice authority that you all examined, this authority to act with or without a badge or stripes and bars as a defender of national interests. Whether those interests are imagined as a way of life, access to jobs, or being replaced vis-a-vis the great replacement theory, conspiracy theory, this alt-right theory or white supremacist theory that calls eugenics discourses into play. So I just wanted to share, in addition to some of what we saw here, I wanted to share one other, social media. Oops. There we go. So this is a post that was shared this past weekend by Million MAGA March attendee, right, where they're voicing their support of military suppression if any leftist chaos transpired, and then they ask if others felt the same way. And they received a number of responses in which people eagerly volunteered, right, to help with the suppression. So one person here replies, no, let the citizenry take care of it free of charge. And another says, I'm a retired LEO, law enforcement officer, and sick of watching home terrorists and terrorist threats at work. I'll volunteer and work for free. So again, we see this kind of volunteerism. But unlike this last person's conjectural tallying of the left on one hand with terrorists on the other, and unlike the alt-right conspiracy theories about sinister plots by the left, racial terrorism vis-a-vis white violence has empirically proven quite deadly. In addition to indirect signaling, sometimes we don't need much decoding, right, to make out a contempt for Black, brown, and Native life. So we certainly saw this necker political brunt of white authority as vigilantism 8 years ago, when George Zimmerman surveilled and ultimately put an end to Trayvon Martin's movements in his gated neighborhood. And then when a Zimmerman-inspired Dylan Roof executed 8 people in Charleston, when George Dunn opened fire on Jordan Davis and his friend for playing hip hop music too loudly, and in the taking of 23 lives in El Paso last summer, when Patrick Crusius attempted to combat what he referred to as cultural and ethnic replacement and a Hispanic invasion, really taking action against this threat of brown bodies, as Norma mentioned. And then also with the murder of Ahmaud Arbery by vigilantes who decided that he was a suspect and in break-ins in their neighborhood. And then we saw it again, but without the same grim outcome when the McCloskeys in St. Louis brandished their semi-automatic rifle and handgun at BLM protesters who they said were trespassing on their property. And of course, white vigilantes also feel authorized to take white people's lives as well, especially if they're deemed a threat to public property or private property. As we saw when Kyle Rittenhouse decided it was his job, and that was his word that he used to protect a Kenosha car dealership, and ended up killing white protesters, Joseph Rosenbaum and Anthony Huber, in the uprising following Jacob Blake's shooting by Kenosha police. And then also with the plot to kidnap Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer, and on and on. And so there's also these other practices of white authority that primarily attempt to police where and how certain bodies move and behave and reproduce. As we learned this evening, white authority may play out through the monitoring and evaluation of others in order to preserve biological whiteness through the policing of racial stock. And eugenics might look like blood quantum theories, miscegenation laws, lynchings of people who were deemed or are deemed a threat to white purity. And it can also look like immigration quotas and forced deportations, or like genocide, rape warfare, or forced sterilizations. But then there's these more mundane modes of white authority that can be realized through policing the language of non-white people to help construct public spaces, white public spaces, Jane Hill has shown us. But in so doing, helping to maintain the ideological and material infrastructure of white normativity, and therefore whiteness as natural and ideal. So, excuse me, this birthright of the authority to police racialized others is also seen among the Permit Patties and Barbecue Beckys and Amy Coopers of the world, who upon determining acts like selling lemonade or having the audacity to monitor a white person's adherence to laws and policies, determine them to be criminal acts. And then when failing to elicit obedience from the Black people in those cases, when they act as authorities, will summon the real police, who they take as kind of being at their disposal, or maybe themselves as proxies or extensions of. And we might really recall how promptly Amy Cooper accessed her power to unleash state violence, right? By, in doing so, effectively issuing the threat of death, literal or social death by way of incarceration, when she called the police on Christian Cooper, and then uttered those words, an African-American man is threatening my life. So what do these different strategies of alt signaling that Norma and Janet shared with us tell us about white authority? This duty, this call to duty, bolstered by these interpretations of coded commands from their leaders and coded threats from the enemy, and justified by a perceived existential threat to whiteness that must be controlled biologically. How does this discursive organizing, mobilizing work not only help to reify whiteness as a standard of citizen and human, but also to authorize those who are white identified to police others' citizenship and humanness, and to take action in doing so. And once we get a better hold of that, as Norma and Jen have already posed, how do we go about collectively divesting of this, and in particular divesting of white authority or whiteness as authority? So to kind of answer my own question or start to answer it, I wanted to share this post from sorry. So this is a post that helps us acknowledge all of the mobilizing and sustaining work on the other side, right? Work that has roots as deep and old and sprawling as white supremacy itself. These are the ways that we come to know and live our citizenship in full humanity, often by disregarding, calling out, naming, and refusing white authority, and even when we might benefit from it ourselves. So ultimately, these ways that we insist on speaking truth to white power, however terrifying it may be. Thank you.
Hi, Crystal. We actually couldn't see that last post. Would you mind sharing your screen again?
Sure. It's a good one. I see. So these are Lakota women who've just captured a Nazi flag that was flying in their community. And they're asserting their real Americanness by doing so.
Well, thank you so much, Crystal, for your valuable comments. Janet and Norma, I wanted to give you a chance first if you wanted to respond to any of Crystal's comments.
I'm still speechlessly processing and thinking about how many flags there are to burn right now. That was really remarkable. Thank you so much, Crystal, and for just bringing it right back around to what is all this discourse doing to reify white authority. And I thought it was actually powerful to hear you talk about other precedents where there's been the blurring of lines between institutional and social policing. It helps to explain in a way why white militia members feel so emboldened and they feel like they're this close to being the state. That's that's part of what's been so creepy about looking at their communications. They're this close to it. They're maybe the legitimate state. They're at the ready to take over.
Yeah.
Doesn't go away. Yeah.
I also want to say thank you so much, Crystal. This is, you know, in some ways you touched on something that I totally forgot to say, which is that one of our challenges is going to be looking at how different segments are interpolated by these strategies. And so the militarization interpolates a particular segment. The inversions of civil rights discourses interpolates. So you'll see that, I mean, as you saw, Janet's data is mostly from the citizenry, and the data that I've presented is mostly from institutions and officials and government people. So we're working different aspects of this, but the way that you framed it, especially at the end, I just need a copy of your comments to sort of chew on a little bit more. But I did want to say, what did I want to say? I'll have to think a little bit more. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much, Janet and Norma. We're going to open up the floor for Q&A. As you know, the Q&A button is at the bottom of your Zoom window for you to post questions if you'd like. And I wanted to acknowledge briefly the great work that Feng Ye and Rebecca Lee are doing behind the scenes in curating and selecting those questions. So thanks, Feng and Rebecca. Our first question here is from Olivia, who has a question about intentionality. She wonders if Trump is consciously performing all these cases of alt signaling, or if, Janet, you're saying that some of these instances are just extrapolating by Trump supporters. So, and if I can sort of add to that, you know, if the supporters are the ones imputing intentionality, you know, kind of what drives this attribution? is a legible text assumed to be an intentional one?
Wow. I mean, there's been so much debate about like how intelligent, how canny is Trump. I mean, I think of him as an idiot savant, and I think that he definitely knows how to make just the right gestures in a way that will stir people up. I don't think he's always exactly aware of, his word choice and so forth. And in fact, at one point he said "stand down" about the Proud Boys, and I'm not sure he intentionally said "stand by," but both are semi-militaristic and were taken as a salute to them. What's going on with the way that people are reading his tweet, the QAnon followers are reading his tweets. I do not think any of that stuff on Trump's part has been intentional. I think there's been a lot of, as I mentioned very briefly, this phenomenon of apophenia, APOPHENIA, where which Susan Lepselter talks about in her book, The Resonance of Unseen Things, which is partly about how conspiracy theories can be so very compelling when people think that they see meaningful connections in otherwise random things. In this case, Trump's missing a letter, or he happened to tweet at 5:59 p.m. or whatever. But it's part of the conviction that these forces of power, waiting imminently to kind of rescue whites from what they perceive as their imperilment by a growing population of color. It's like it's right there under the surface, and they're just sure that people are organizing and their leader is going to save them. And so it seems like the conviction is that strong that they're going to detect meaning even when there isn't any.
Well, I did mention the fact that we need to take Trump as one piece of the puzzle, but really there's a lot of other authors who are feeding him lines, and chief among whom is Stephen Miller. But I'll tell you that I'm on the Trump supporter email list, and in there we see a lot of the same patterns, right? And these are clearly, there's no way that that's him, because there's about 1 or 2 missives an hour, much more frequent now that he's lost the election. But many of them are playing on some of the themes that he's created. So for instance, occasionally you'll have one that purports to be from Donald Trump Jr. and he'll say, "My father is asking about you," right? Just totally creepy. Or, "It's time for us to fight. I have not given up. I need your money." I mean, all of these are appeals for funding. And they are all exactly in the flavor of Trump speak that we've become accustomed to, and clearly not all of them are Trump. So yeah.
Crystal, did you want to add?
I mean, I'm learning about all of this as through this process, especially in terms of the degrees of coding and all of that. So I mean, my sense is that, I don't know. I don't. It's hard for me not to believe that he knows that that this uptake is common. So even if he's not specifically signaling particular meanings, seems to be encouraging of this type of reading into all of the things that he shares. So yeah, I'm not really sure, but I try to do it now.
He's disingenuous when he says, like, "I don't know who QAnon is. I don't know
Oh,
who
yeah.
the Proud Boys are." That's totally disingenuous, even if he himself is not truly colluding with Q with
Right.
all this code. And he is stoking this idea of these shadowy truths, the thugs on the plane, for instance. I can't say more than that,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Biden's being controlled by someone else. Can't say more than that. He's absolutely stoking the fire.
Yeah, but at the same time, if you look at the kind of corpus of his rallies, a lot of them have very, very similar turns of phrase, right? So, you know, he'll say things word for word. He'll repeat things word for word. So clearly they're crafted. And I used to think it was just him bragging about how he made grown men cry. But when it was time for the Republican National Convention, Ivanka told the exact same story. So it's clearly, you know, it's a family story, at least, if not a campaign story.
Thank you for your insights. We're running a little short on time, so I wanted to package two questions that we got together because they're speaking to the issues that you're raising now. Which is the first one is for Maureen, who says we're trapped in an abyss of misinformation and ambiguity. In a post-truth society, many simply reject expert opinion, especially those from the social sciences. In your opinion, how can we apply the tools of the linguistic anthropology to try and fight against this? And I'm going to pair that with a question from Ruthie, who's asking a kind of similar thing. Do you think that the American education system has contributed to these undercurrents of eugenics and racism? How can we go about a restructuring of the education system in the distribution of news and facts? So Norma and Janet, if you want to take a turn first and then go to Crystal.
Do you want to go first, Janet?
Norma, do you want to fix this problem, this national problem?
Yeah, I think all of us are complicit in the undercurrents of eugenics and racism. I used to be, as Janet knows, I used to be obsessed with word frequencies of Trump's speech. And part of the reason I thought that I wound up not pursuing it, our publisher thought we would get sued. But anyway, part of the reason I was obsessed with it is because I thought if I can just prove that he is that his brain is going away, then this will be over, right? Like we can just show that he's not fit to be president. But that is exactly the same logic. That does not unsettle the logics of eugenics, right? For me to want to call out that he has a worse vocabulary than he used to is actually operating under that same logic. The Fitbit that I have on my wrist is operating under the same logic of perfectibility of the body. So I think we are all complicit in this way of thinking. I'm not sure how we can fix our education system if we, you know, if the Fitbit tells me that my pulse is good for my age and race and weight, right? I mean, we're all like brainwashed. It's kind of frustrating. Janet?
I mean, I'm stymied. It's a really good question. Like, what can linguistic anthropologists do? I don't know. I know that the authors who contributed to our volume tried to make the tools that they're using to analyze accessible to the public, to define the theoretical tools and make them accessible so that people could have maybe feel like they had a little more of a purchase on what has been going on with Trump and beyond. But it doesn't reach the many people who are just in an alt at this point willing to pursue an alt reality, you know, moving from Facebook and Twitter over to parlor.com because there's less oversight there and they can just stoke their own lies about the election, for instance, having been stolen. What can linguistic anthropologists do? I don't know. I do think that there are linguistic dynamics we didn't talk about today. I talk about it a little in the introduction to the book where there is a critical mass of Trump voters who feel like they've been patronized by coastal elites, including people in the university system, and that some of that dynamic has had to do with language use. It's a very difficult problem because, you know, the push for certain kinds of care and change in language comes from the push for social justice, but it's coming across as patronizing to some people. And this is a language ideology divide. We haven't even touched on this, like I say, today. But I wonder if linguistic anthropologists could give perhaps more attention to that cleavage in language ideology. It's very, very hard to solve because it's awfully hard to compromise with people who are thinking in ways that seem so pernicious, so toxic, and ultimately so deadly.
Crystal, do you want to add anything?
I kind of wanted to think a little bit about Ruthie's question in particular. Um, so, I mean, I think we have to start with or continue this work of kind of reimagining what schools are and their role in society. So, you know, I'm thinking of like Savannah Shangai's work, looking at uh, what progressivism, you know, in its most well-intended and probably one of its better like kind of executed forms or modes, like how it's still invested in a lot of very deep-seated ideas about human value at the end of the day, that um, that will take a lot of work to kind of move away from before a different agenda for schools and within schools, a different kind of curricula, different kinds of curricula can be implemented. But I think that work, I'd like to think that that's happening. But in connecting it to these undercurrents of eugenics, I was just really moved by Norma's commentary of our complicity, because it's really about ableism, right? And these ableist ideas that we all, or many of us, just reproduce on the daily and use to regulate our own bodies and all of that. So yeah, the really deep like ideological excavating that has to happen seems to be underway, but we'll definitely need to continue and maybe more robustly before a structure like school as an extension really of the state would ever, you know, could ever be a site for doing something different.
Right. So is what I'm hearing, you're saying that education is not necessarily the central institution for making these changes or the central source of these ideologies, that they come from different places as well.
Yeah, at least schooling, as formal schooling, formal education. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you again. I'm going to have one more question. I think this may be our last question for the day. It's kind of a methodological one. I think we've gotten a little sense of where you get your data from, since you've talked about the list hosts that you're on and email subscriptions that you have. But Pratiksha asks, I was interested in knowing where the memes/images were collected from. I think referring to those in Janet's section. Specific right-wing social media groups, Google image search. What are the methods for conducting research of this nature?
Mm-hmm. So, you know, I've always avoided like teaching a methods class in my department because I'm no like sociologist. I'm very opportunistic, and I just kind of find an interesting trail and follow it. But it's not hard on Twitter to find people who are following QAnon, people who are posting the kinds of tweets that I've reproduced and screenshot. All you have to do is type in the right hashtag, you know, hashtag Trump 2020. And then you look at who they're following. And, you know, it's really actually pretty easy to find those, and they will lead you to a lot of memes. I simply noticed the spike in the right-wing chatter in things like, you know, the liberal crybaby, liberal snowflake phenomenon when Trump was elected and inaugurated. Used the tool of Google Trends to see how those phrases of liberal crybaby and liberal snowflakes were spiking like crazy right around that time. And then just you do an image search for these phrases, and you pull up all the creativity of the right in those memes. As for the email that I shared, I had a neighbor, I did a couple of decades of ethnographic work in East Africa, and one of my neighbors in East Africa was a far right-wing American evangelical who has had me on her email group ever since the late 1990s. And I have an extraordinary archive, you know, starting with all the trutherism stuff, the birtherism stuff about Obama, all the right-wing cartoons. Then she would just send me everything, and I kept a whole lot of it. And I noticed actually, there's another person I know who's also got me on the similar kind of group, and I get all of his, and sometimes his and hers. He's in Georgia, she's been in Pennsylvania. Sometimes they're sending the same stuff around. So, Yeah, it's not hard to find this stuff. would not claim to be systematic, but hey, I'm not a sociologist. I'm an anthropologist.
The corpus that I have found is from factbay.se, and it's a publicly searchable corpus of everything Trump has ever said, done, or tweeted. And yeah, so possibly Trump's, I see the question from Juan Rodriguez that Trump's Twitter account could provide a body of discursive material for people to consider as sort of like the given text, and that's a possibility. It wouldn't be too hard for somebody to get a hold of everything. So for those of you who want to join in the analysis, there is that source.
Thank you so much. Our time is up, and I know there are a couple more questions that we haven't been able to get to. I would invite everyone to bring them again to our December 11th final colloquium, where we will be inviting all our speakers back as a panel to reflect on the entire presidential election and the aftermath. So that final
wait, it will still be going on.
Right. That final colloquium will be our next and last, and you can access it using the same Zoom link that you used to access this meeting. And again, that's on December 11th. So if you would like to revisit any part of the presentation today, or you have friends who could not make it today, we will be sharing a link to a recording of the presentation at a later date through your registered Eventbrite email address. And if you'd like to receive further updates about similar events and content, do follow the Society of Linguistic Anthropology on Facebook and Twitter. Once again, thank you to our panelists, to Crystal for discussing, and thank you so much for joining us, and have a great rest of the day.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Take care.
Take care. That was amazing. Thank you.
If panelists would like to debrief, just give us about 60 seconds to clear everyone from the room.
Okay.
Hi, Vera, I was going to ask you to help me remove the last few people, but people are exiting on their own. We're almost there, folks. Just one more moment. Okay, the room is empty.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. That was really awesome. I know Rebecca, Lily, I don't know how you did that. There was so many, all our messages were just going all over the place for you. But you maintained such a calm demeanor.
Wow. Was everything okay?
It was good. We just had a lot of last questions come up, last minute questions that we were obviously unable to get to, unfortunately. But yeah. We have saved them so that we can just re-ask these questions on behalf of these participants during the final colloquium. So hopefully that will work.
Did we have any crazy people?
No, we were fine.
Yay!
I guess because it was you have to ask questions with your names tagged on it, so we never had that issue. But I just wanted to thank everybody. Thank you so much for that. Really, and I agree with Lily. It was a really chilling and scary talk that I think is really needed at this time, just to remind ourselves too of what we need to do as researchers, I suppose. And so I think we had great attendance. A lot of people stayed till the end.
Wow, yeah, I saw.
Yeah, and I would like to, of course, for Norma and Janet, you will be coming back with that roundtable with Kira, but then Crystal, we would totally love to have you as well, to participate and provide your insight with, the questions that we hope more people will be asking questions kind of as a whole poll. And Lily, you too, please. Does anybody have any
Yeah.
things to say?
I
We
just really want to thank everybody and thank Crystal
Yeah.
for this incredible commentary.
Yeah, that was amazing. I mean, it was like
Yeah.
getting the third talk. And it was powerful. I mean, really.
Yeah.
I mean, you're
Especially
I don't know
because,
if you saw. Oh, sorry.
go ahead.
Maureen, in the question and answer, was saying that she thought everyone should have a copy of your comments, just as Norma and
Yes,
Janet were
and that was the
asking for them,
question I
like-
needed to ask. Are you willing to share your comments, perhaps with our, not just only with, we're going to share the YouTube link of the talk, of course. And I think I was wondering if we could also share the comments along with that. But we can definitely bring this conversation into email, because I know that you guys have some reservations on how long you want the YouTube video
Yeah.
to be up. So we could do that there if that's okay.
I just wanted to say again how amazing this talk was. I was, you know, very emotional listening to it. It was really hard to hear and to, you know, and I can't imagine how hard it is to do that kind of work. I've been kind of trying to steer clear of it because it's so toxic. But it's so important, as Belda was saying, and was saying. So just thank you again, and thank you for letting me get to speak on it and sit with it.
Thank you so
Yeah.
much.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you,
I don't want
everyone.
to keep anybody, and so please enjoy the rest of your Monday, I guess. Thank you again so much for supporting us and for being here.
Lily, thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks, Joe.
I'll see
Yes,
some of
thank
you in
you.
a couple of weeks. Yeah,
Yes,
I'll see
we
a
will.
couple of some of you in a few weeks. All right.
Bye. Thanks, Fong.
Fingers
Thanks,
crossed.
Rebecca.
Deep breaths. Hopefully we can get to the next few weeks with minimal chaos, and then we'll see. We'll see where we go for the next decade, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. See you guys.
All right.
Bye.
Be well.
Bye,
Bye.
everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks a million.
Thank you.